Walk into any major supermarket today, and you are walking through a massive psychological illusion. The brightly lit aisles, the stacked pyramids of fresh produce, the endless varieties of processed snacks. It all projects a sense of absolute abundance. But if you look past the branding and pull back the layers of corporate economic data, a terrifying paradox emerges. We are currently living through the most expensive food era in modern history, where the average household spends a record-breaking percentage of their disposable income just to keep the pantry functional. The trap isn't that the food is disappearing. The trap is that the middle class is quietly running out of the liquidity required to buy it. Most people sitting in comfortable apartments right now are exactly one bad month, one sudden medical bill, or one corporate downsizing away from an empty refrigerator. And the most unsettling part? They have absolutely no idea how fragile their baseline security actually is. During the dark winter of 1932, 15 million Americans lost their jobs almost overnight. The economic machinery of the country ground to a sudden, violent halt. Yet, the tragedy of the Great Depression wasn't a famine caused by drought or crop failure. The fields were bursting with grain, and livestock was plentiful. The catastrophe was purely mechanical. The systemic distribution of wealth collapsed, leaving millions with zero purchasing power, while food literally rotted in the fields because farmers afford to harvest it. In the middle of this systemic paralysis, ordinary families had to rewrite the rules of survival. They didn't starve because they engineered a new way of eating. They looked at the absolute bottom shelf of the pantry, at bones, at vegetable peels, at cheap tins of processed protein, and bags of dried legumes, and they figured out how to keep an entire generation alive. They relied on 12 specific foods that defied the economics of scarcity. Right now, as grocery bills outpace wage growth and credit card debt, used exclusively for basic sustenance hits historic highs, a quiet migration is happening inside American supermarkets. People aren't buying these 12 foods out of retro nostalgia or culinary curiosity. They are buying them because the math works when nothing else does. The financial veneer of modern life is cracking, forcing a structural return to the exact same survival mechanics that saved the country nearly a century ago. This brings us to a critical anomaly that sits at the center of this entire crisis. There is one specific food item, holding the absolute #1 spot on our list, that you have likely walked past hundreds of times without a second glance. It sits quietly in an unglamorous aisle, wrapped in cheap metal, completely dismissed by the modern culinary elite. Yet, this single item carries a profound historical weight. It literally fueled global military campaigns, sustained entire broken economies, and is currently disappearing from store shelves faster than factories can produce it as inflation tightens its grip. What is the hidden mechanism behind this unglamorous staple, and why does its sudden resurgence serve as the ultimate warning sign for the modern economy? To understand how we ended up back at the precipice of survival cooking, we have to look closely at the 12 items that are bridging the gap between historical desperation and modern reality. These foods represent a masterclass in domestic engineering, dishes designed to maximize caloric density, eliminate waste, and trick the human brain into feeling full when the reality of the plate says otherwise. We begin this countdown not with a meal, but with a bizarre chemical anomaly that proved a mother's desperation could outsmart a completely broken supply chain. A recipe born out of absolute absence, which proved that human dignity could still be preserved even when the kitchen was entirely bare. To trace the origins of this architectural shift in food consumption, one must look at the structural failures of the American agricultural system between 1929 and 1933. The narrative of the Great Depression often focuses entirely on the Wall Street crash of October 1929. However, the geographic and economic traps that dictated what Americans ate were set years earlier by structural overproduction, unsustainable farm debt, and highly reactive federal monetary policies. During World War I, American farmers expanded operations aggressively to feed a disrupted Europe, leveraging their land to buy high-priced machinery. When European agriculture recovered in the 1920s, global prices collapsed, leaving American producers trapped in a cycle of debt. By the time the broader economy contracted, rural banks failed by the thousands, freezing the credit lines that allowed agricultural logistics to function, The resulting logistical paralysis created a stark geographical paradox. In the winter of 1932, lines of trucks dumped millions of gallons of milk into lower ditches, and farmers in Oregon slaughtered thousands of sheep, leaving them to rot in canyons because the cost of freight to transport the livestock to market exceeded the final sale price. Simultaneously, 3,000 miles away in New York and Chicago, bread lines stretched for blocks, and municipal health clinics reported that over 20% of school-age children suffered from chronic malnutrition. The food existed, but the mechanism to move it had dissolved. This systemic disconnect forced a radical transformation in domestic food management, shifting the focus from nutritional variety to raw caloric survival. The historical data shows that the federal response was slow, highly experimental, and ultimately localized. The early years of Hoover's administration relied heavily on private charity and municipal relief funds, both of which collapsed under the sheer volume of need by late 1931. When the Roosevelt administration introduced the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, the strategy was counterintuitive. The government paid farmers to destroy crops and slaughter livestock to artificially raise wholesale prices. While this stabilized commodity markets, it exacerbated immediate urban food shortages. In response, local relief agencies, community networks, and home economists began distributing highly standardized instructional leaflets detailing how to cook with the absolute cheapest, shelf-stable ingredients available. This institutional push codified a survival taxonomy that still exists today. The primary economic trigger for these recipes was the absolute elimination of animal fats and dairy products, which had spiked in price due to distribution bottlenecks. This brings us back to item number 12, wacky cake. The recipe emerged across the Midwest as a direct reaction to the complete absence of eggs, butter, and fresh milk. By substituting vegetable oil for butter and utilizing the chemical reaction between white vinegar and sodium bicarbonate to achieve leavening, home cooks bypassed the entire broken dairy supply chain. The distribution of this recipe was entirely organic, printing in small-town newspapers and passing through church community cookbooks, proving that industrial chemistry could stabilize domestic morale when agriculture failed. As urban populations adjusted to prolonged economic stagnation, the focus shifted to stretching animal proteins. Between 1930 and 1935, the per capita consumption of fresh beef dropped by over 30%, replaced by cheaper cuts, offal, and heavily extended ground meats. This economic reality popularized item number 11, stuffed bell peppers, and item number 7, sloppy joes. Archival records from municipal soup kitchens in Detroit indicate that extending ground beef with rolled oats, dried breadcrumbs, or boiled rice allowed facilities to double their meal output without increasing their operational budgets. The geography of the American home changed. Kitchens became processing centers, where the goal was to obscure the lack of resources through physical volume and heavy seasoning. Simultaneously, the industrialization of the American pantry accelerated, creating long-term dependencies on corporate food processing that persist in the current inflationary cycle. Companies like Campbell Soup Company, Hormel Foods, and the processors of hydrogenated vegetable fats saw stable demand because their products offered something fresh agriculture could not: absolute predictability. A can of condensed tomato soup, introduced commercially at the turn of the century, became an economic anchor when combined with processed American cheese and stale bread to form item number 10, the classic grilled cheese and tomato soup pairing. This wasn't merely comfort. It was a highly calculated allocation of funds. Processed cheese didn't spoil, canned soup lasted indefinitely, and factory bread was cheap. This historical trajectory directly mirrors the modern economic landscape of 2026. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that, over the past 24 months, grocery prices have risen at an annualized rate that significantly outpaces median wage adjustments. The core drivers are structurally identical to those of the 1930s. Rising transportation costs, supply chain vulnerabilities, and corporate consolidation of food distribution. The modern consumer, facing high rent and escalating debt service, is encountering the exact same geographic and economic traps that faced their great-grandparents. As fresh meat and organic produce become luxury items, the contemporary supermarket layout is quietly directing buyers toward the bottom shelves, toward the dried legumes, the starches, and the canned proteins that built the baseline of survival nearly a century ago. The contemporary transition back to these survival staples is driven by a stark structural conflict within the modern food ecosystem. According to the 2025 Consumer Expenditure Reports from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the lowest quintile of American households now allocates over 25% of their post-tax income entirely to groceries. This economic pressure has triggered a visible data shift. Sales of fresh, high-protein items have systematically flattened, while high-volume starches and shelf-stable legumes have experienced double-digit demand spikes. The reality on the ground contradicts corporate assurances of stabilizing inflation markets. Families are actively managing a severe cost of living crisis by rationing their protein consumption and relying on the exact mathematical combinations of starch and plant protein that defined the early 20th century. The structural clash is most visible when analyzing the mechanics of items 9, 6, 5, 4, and 3 on the survival list: potato soup, leftover soup, rice and beans, cornbread and pinto beans, and lentil soup. These items are expanding their market share because they represent total efficiency in a closed kitchen economy. Municipal waste characterization studies conducted in major urban centers show a sharp decline in residential food waste since 2024. Consumers are adopting what historical researchers call a zero-risk survival protocol. The practice of boiling potato skins for starch, freezing chicken skeletons for secondary gelatin extraction, and repurposing vegetable trimmings into base broths has moved from rural homesteading subcultures directly into suburban working-class households out of sheer financial necessity. The operational economics of dried legumes highlight why this shift is occurring. Wholesale data confirms that dried pinto beans and green lentils deliver the lowest cost per gram of protein of any commodity currently available in North American retail markets. A single metric ton of dried lentils provides approximately 2.5 million calories and 180,000 grams of protein. When prepared at home, a standard 1-pound bag of lentils costing less than $2 yields over 3 pounds of cooked food. This extreme volume multiplication bypasses the commercial cold chain entirely. By eliminating the need for refrigerated transport and specialized retail display, dried legumes remain insulated from the soaring energy surcharges that have driven fresh beef, poultry, and pork prices out of reach for millions of hourly wage workers. This reliance on low-cost inputs has created a deep policy rift between federal nutritional guidance and real-world economic survival. While the Department of Agriculture continues to promote dietary models rich in fresh seafood, lean meats, and diverse out-of-season produce, the financial reality of the minimum wage dictates a completely different plate. In major metropolitan areas, a worker earning the baseline federal wage must work nearly 2 full hours just to purchase a single pound of choice ribeye steak. Conversely, that same hour of labor converts into 15 pounds of dried rice and pinto beans. The math is absolute and unyielding. The modern working-class family is not choosing their diet based on contemporary health trends. They are selecting items based on systemic constraints that mirror the structural poverty of the 1930s. Furthermore, supply chain metrics from regional logistics hubs indicate that the commercial infrastructure itself is bending under this shifting demand. Supermarket conglomerates have quietly adjusted their shelf allocations, expanding the square footage dedicated to bulk dried goods, private label canned items, and industrial-sized bags of rice. The conflict here is no longer hidden. It plays out daily in the competitive pricing wars between low-cost discount grocers and traditional supermarkets, with the former seeing unprecedented foot traffic from demographics that historically frequented premium retail chains. The data indicates that the buffer between middle-class security and baseline food insecurity has narrowed to its slimmest margin since the mid-20th century, leaving millions dependent on an unglamorous, high-starch survival diet to avoid outright insolvency.